Before we start today, I have to tell you about State Farm agent Brian McDevitt. A lot of our listeners have gone to him for all their insurance needs, and he's been very helpful in getting them the coverage they deserve. There's no games with Brian. He's just here to help and make sure you feel safe. So if you have insurance needs and you haven't called him yet, what are you waiting for? Dial up that number, 630-796-2662. That's 630-796-2662. Or find him online at ryanismyagent.com. That's ryanismyagent.com, and make sure to mention Sports Talk Chicago. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Sports Talk Chicago. Here with Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's a fantasy football analyst for NFL Network, a writer for NFL.com, and the host of the Adam Rank podcast. Please welcome Adam Rank to the program. Adam, it's great to have you on. How are you?
Oh, my gosh. Thank you so much for having me. Always great to be on in Chicago, so I appreciate this.
So, Adam, what was your reaction to the Justin Fields pick, first off?
Unbridled joy. Like, it was so, like, I don't know. Like, it's kind of like waiting for your team to, like, close out a championship match, be it a Super Bowl, Stanley Cup, whatever it is. Just waiting. When we were on the clock, just the joy. Like, of course, you're a Chicago fan, so there's the dread of, like, this is going to be Mac Jones, isn't it? But at the same time, you were so excited for it to be Justin Fields. You couldn't help yourself. And for me, you know, I'm not a young man. That's not even accurate compared to my dad and my uncles, who've seen Bobby Douglas. Like, my best quarterback in my lifetime, that's McMahon, Jay Cutler, and Walter Payton on the halfback option. And that's the list. So to have a quarterback to be this excited about is something else.
You think he's the savior for the Bears?
I hope so. This was the guy that we wanted. And I know that, you know, there's no guarantees with these quarterbacks, but I feel a lot better being in this position. If you think about the thing with Mitch Trubisky is it's a lot like what the 49ers are talking about with Trey Lance. Like, he's tall, he's athletic, got a lot of upside, hasn't played a lot of football. You're like, yeah, that's kind of a problem for me. Justin Fields is hey, we've seen him dominate in college. Why do more people not want him? So I'm happy to take that on. And if he can have a similar type on-the-field career of guys like Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson, I will be very happy about that.
Why do you think he slipped? I mean, if he has so much experience and obviously a good track record, why did he slip all the way down to the Bears?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think people got caught up in the emotion of Zach Wilson's amazing year, which came against no competition. Like, I would normally make fun of him for playing a Mountain West schedule, but number one, BYU's not in the Mountain West anymore. Their schedule wasn't even that good. And then Trey Lance, again, was just the guy that everybody, you know, they hyped up because of the athleticism. And, you know, we see these quarterbacks fall. And I don't know if these scouts fall into the same habits of fans, you know, because when Patrick Mahomes was taken, I remember a lot of NFL talking heads being like, well, Texas Tech has never produced these quarterbacks. Like, they put up great numbers in college and they never go on and do anything. And I don't know if that's a thing with the scouts getting into their mind that Ohio State quarterbacks are the same way, but perhaps that's part of it. It makes no sense otherwise. And then they started talking about, you know, like, oh, perhaps, you know, he has epilepsy or he has this, or like, okay, listen, none of this stuff has mattered before. And he's gone out there and we've seen him go against Trevor Lawrence and put on a show. So I don't understand what's happening, why people are being valued over Justin Fields. I'm just glad that the Broncos, the Lions, who else did it? But like a lot of those teams that passed on him, the Panthers, the Falcons even, like, I'm glad they made the decision. And I hope that the Bears go back and make them pay for it. I want to be on the other end of the like, hey, you could have had Patrick Mahomes. I would love to be on the other end telling people like, hey, you could have had Justin Fields, but hey, we got him.
Adam Rank here on Sports Talk Chicago. Adam, should Fields start game one, do you think?
No, I understand what Matt Nagy was talking about and the plan that they have in place. And, you know, we're looking at a long season and hopefully a long career. And I think that if Justin Fields ends up being the player that we expect him and want him to be, I don't think anybody's going to look back 5 years from now and be like, "Hey, remember when he didn't start Week 1 in Los Angeles?" Nobody's going to care. So I'm gonna put the trust on the coaches and hope that they can that they know what they're doing. And I'll leave it at that. When he needs to play, he'll probably be on the field. I think that Lions game, or the first game back after the Steelers game, because it was the bye week, or two that I look at and like, that's a possibility right there. But again, hopefully it's just one of those instances too. Like, remember when Dak Prescott was starting with the Dallas Cowboys? He looked way better than Tony Romo, and they weren't going to start him. And it was an injury to Romo that propelled Dak to the starting spot, and they went 13-3 and went to the playoffs. And I'm not wishing an injury on Andy Dalton, but I just hope that if Justin Fields is clearly the quarterback and is clearly the quarterback that gives the Bears the best chance to win, that he is going to be the starter.
Well, do you think if he looks the best, he still may not play? Is that something you would run past Matt Nagy?
He seems infatuated with following in the footsteps of Andy Reid and the way he brought in Patrick Mahomes, and maybe not to the extent of having Justin Fields sit an entire season, but still trying to slow play everything and make sure everything is copacetic. And I understand that everybody loves Andy Reid. Well, not Le'Veon Bell, but everybody else loves Andy Reid, and they want to follow in his footsteps. So I don't know. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. When he says he's got a plan, I don't know. I just got to trust him. I know I'm one of the few Bears fans who actually still likes Matt Nagy and is like, yeah, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Like he's won a lot of games, and his quarterbacks have been Trubisky and Foles and Chase Daniel. Like I think he deserves a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. So I'm willing to extend him that courtesy.
What's the approach here from a fantasy perspective? If someone's trying to get a Bears quarterback for their fantasy team, who do you recommend drafting, Fields or Dalton?
Oh, no, you're going to want to go with Fields, because normally with the quarterback position, because there's so many good ones, you can wait on a quarterback and you can draft somebody like, let's say, for instance, you waited on a quarterback, you took Ryan Tannehill, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, Matt Stafford, somebody like that, where you're feeling pretty confident. I think especially this season, it would behoove you to draft Justin Fields as a stash player, number one, because this is the longest season in NFL history with that 17th game. And, just to see what happens if Justin Fields does break out, if he does have that kind of Justin Herbert type breakout and goes out there and crushes it, then he's on your bench and on your roster and you're ready to go and you can flip him or do something like that or just start him, So I think that you're definitely going to want Justin Fields on your team.
What do you think about Vegas prop bet saying 3,000 passing yards and 15 touchdowns? Could he hit those numbers this year?
Well, I don't know what Vegas odds are as an NFL. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, if he started, I like him. I would like a total touchdown number for him more, because I think he can run some in. But I think we did see that he likes throwing touchdowns. For as good as he is, for as much as he runs, as fast as he is and everything, he's still pretty good about throwing the football. We saw that in the game against against Clemson. So I think that 3,000 passing yards might be a touch ambitious, but I like the 15 passing yards or 15 passing touchdowns.
What's your expectation for the Bears overall this year? Like, when you look at their schedule, how many wins do you see right now?
I think a lot of it will come down to what happens with the Green Bay Packers. Like, that's two pivotal games that could swing the course of this season. And unfortunately, I still see them in that 8 to 10 wins range. I think the defense, the change in defensive coordinator should help out a lot. I think a lot of it's going to come down to Jalen Johnson and how much he's going to be able to make the transition to be a number one shutdown corner. Is Eddie Jackson going to be able to get back to the form that he had when Vic Fangio was the defensive coordinator? Is Eddie Goldman going to be back? If we can get some of these guys healthy and ready to go, if Bobby Quinn can actually go out there, and Bobby Quinn got to the quarterback, he just wasn't putting up the sack numbers, but his pressure rate was really good according to our own next gen stats. The offensive line looks much improved. I mean, that's the one thing that, gets overlooked from the draft, is that Justin Fields was so amazing, but getting Tevin Jenkins, that was incredible too. Because I think a lot of us were of the mind of like, if that's who we would have picked at number 20, like, okay, that would have been a good pick. I would have felt pretty comfortable with that. So to get him in the second round was pretty great. So there should be a lot of optimism. And again, you look around the division, like Detroit, I don't know what's going on with Dan Campbell. It's not going to be surprising to me when Anthony Lynn's the coach next year. Then you got the Vikings doing the whole bring your son to work day, because Kubiak's kid's the offensive coordinator, Zimmer's kid's the defensive coordinator. Everybody just assumes that they're just like, oh, this team is a top 5 roster. I'm like, what are you talking about? I know Darisaw was fine, and they did extend Daniel Hunter, which is good for them. But it's like, at the same time, it's like Vikings fans need to calm down. Like they always overestimate their team, but I don't know. I think there's a good opportunity, and I say this as like fans that need to calm down as I'm going crazy for Justin Fields, but I feel like there's a reason to be optimistic about this Bears team. Playoffs 2 out of the last 3 years, and they just improved. So I think that there should be an expectation to 8, 9, 10, 11, or let's not go 12, but let's go 10 wins. I think that's a reasonable expectation.
Could there be a playoff appearance this year for the Bears?
I hope so. I really do. I think, I'm trying to judge it by, looking around the league. Like if Green Bay comes back, if they screw this up with Aaron Rodgers, which, we're all hoping for, the Saints should regress a little bit. The Panthers are still a work in progress. The Seahawks and the Cardinals are great, but man, they both have issues in their defensively. And I think as Stephon Gilmore is being dangled by the New England Patriots, first of all, I think the Bears, like, maybe are we in on this? It's easy cap hit. But also those teams need to address their positions as well. So I think that there's an opportunity there in the NFC, especially with 7 teams that make the playoffs now. I think the Bears are a playoff team.
Is that the main goal for this season, though? Would you rather see great development from Fields and maybe a below 500 record, or go for it all this year and see what could happen?
I really do believe that the most important thing for this season is understanding what you have with Justin Fields. And I think I would use the Chargers as the example here, where last year they didn't make the playoffs. They had a nice little run at the end of the season, but they knew that they had their quarterback of the future. And that is a nice feeling going into a following season. And I think no matter what happens for the Bears, I think any Bears fan will be like, number one, let's win a Super Bowl. Winning a Super Bowl would be super fun. But number two, if we go through this season and we know that Justin Fields is our quarterback of the future, I think that's the biggest gift we could get out of all of this, outside of hoisting another Lombardi trophy.
Adam Brack, still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Adam, who's your top fantasy pick for each position so far this year?
Well, I'm still going Christian McCaffrey with the first overall pick. I know a lot of people were burned last year and they kind of have some hesitation. So I love McCaffrey. I think a lot of people will be down on Clyde Edwards-Helaire this year because of what happened last season. Didn't have the rookie year that a lot of people thought he was going to, but he was still, the RB20. I'm sorry that you drafted him in the first or second round, but he was still a pretty productive fantasy back, and if he gets stronger, he'll be better. I think I'm jumping around positions too. At the quarterback position, again, I would advise waiting on a quarterback because later on, if you're in a 12-team league, you're going to have your pick of guys like Ryan Tannehill, Jalen Hurts, Matthew Stafford, Joe Burrow. All of those guys can finish in the top 5 this season. You're going to be able to draft them much later. Feel very comfortable with that. Feel very comfortable with A.J. Brown. I know a lot of people were concerned when they went out there and got Julio Jones that perhaps A.J. Brown's ascension to being the wide receiver 1 this season was going to be derailed. But I actually look at it as a good thing because you got to remember, last year the Tennessee Titans had Jonnu Smith and Corey Davis in a breakout season, and A.J. Brown was still very good. And now, to me, Julio kind of steps in to take the production left over from Jonnu Smith and his 10 touchdowns. So I think that they both can coexist. So I love A.J. Brown this season. And, of course, my guy, Travis Kelce. Don't be afraid. If you're sitting there at the back end of the first round, don't be afraid to take Travis Kelce because he is so much better statistically than his peers that the advantage that you get from having him as opposed to, say, Darren Waller, because Darren Waller was the number 2 tight end last year, but the gap was so wide. Like the gap between Kelce and Waller was like the gap between Waller and the number 12 tight end. Like it's crazy. And Waller was not as overall, he finished with the second most fantasy points, but there was a lot of volatility week to week with him. Kelce is just such a strong, steady presence that I would look at him. So those are my guys that I'm looking at this season. Also, and I hate to say this, Darnell Mooney is going to be really good. Actually, I don't hate to say that at all. But Darnell Mooney, by the way, let me tell you something. When these all pros are chirping about Darnell Mooney, and it all stemmed, it might have even been my fault. Like they had this thing of, there was the check down, put out an Instagram, they put up an IG post of Ramsey about the tough receivers that he's playing. And I said, hey, don't forget about Darnell Mooney. Put a move on him last year, innocent. And then Jalen Ramsey took that, responded, I don't care about that. Shut up. And then he went on to every IG account of every Bears fan that had 1,000 followers and was commenting on every single one of them. And you're like, bro, what are you doing? He's like, well, they're tagging me in these photos. I'm like, you've got a million followers. How do you know? You're obviously seeking this out. And then Darnell Savage is out there moaning about it too. I'm like, well, if Darnell Mooney is really getting into the heads of these guys, then maybe there is something to this. So don't be afraid to take Darnell Mooney this year. Oh, by the way, here's another tip too. The Cowboys receiver you want is CeeDee Lamb. You don't want Amari Cooper. I'll sneak that one in.
Why do you say that?
You know what? I thought last year he was really starting to develop a little bit of chemistry with Dak Prescott. Small sample size, of course. But I think that with a full offseason, and Dak, remember last year there was abbreviated training camp. So a lot of these rookies were kind of behind, development-wise. It's amazing that guys like Justin Jefferson and even CeeDee Lamb were able to do as well as they did, given the limited ramp up to the start of the season. But I think that now that you've given them another opportunity to work with these quarterbacks, I think that CeeDee Lamb's talent is just going to blossom with the Cowboys. And we know one thing about Mike McCarthy, he loves to throw the football. And I think that this is going to be the year that CeeDee Lamb has that kind of Chris Godwin, Calvin Ridley type breakout. So I'm very fired up for him.
Who's overvalued in fantasy this year that you've seen?
Well, I love to wait on quarterbacks. That's one of my things. I just think that you get such great value waiting on them. And so when somebody drafts Kyler Murray ahead of me, I always say, good. I'm glad that you're doing that, because last year Kyler was great. Make no mistake, he's a good player. I don't want to drag him. I'm talking about mostly for the price. You're overpaying for something. You know what I'm saying? If somebody was paying for, $80 for Lou Malnati's, you're like, bro, I'm going to go somewhere else and get a pizza. You don't have to pay that much for that pizza. We can go somewhere else. Not that it's not good, but you might just be overpaying for it, And so I look at it last year in 8 of the first 9 games, he had at least 1 rushing touchdown and 1 passing touchdown in 8 of 9 games, which was incredible. 27 total touchdowns in those 9 games. And he was fantastic. Over the last 7, he had 10 total touchdowns. He had a clear drop off. And that is something that concerns me. And I think a lot of people who had Kyler Murray last season know this all too well. You were rolling along and you're like, I'm going to win my league because Kyler's crushing it. And then he fell off at the end of the year. That offense, when they went 2-5 over those last 7 games, they were averaging 9 points a game. And their response was to go get A.J. Green and James Conner. And I'm like, okay, we'll see what happens. So I'm a little worried about that one. I like the player, but I'm really worried that the production's not going to be sustainable over the course of a season.
How about your top sleeper pick for this year? Who's someone kind of under the weeds right now that could pop up and be good production for a fantasy player?
Oh, I don't want to do this because it's actually a Packer.
Really?
And I kind of like A.J. Dillon. I think that was, as much as we like to make fun of the Packers for not drafting a receiver, and even last year going for a running back who was going for a running back when it wasn't really a need for them. I thought A.J. Dillon, I like the way he played at the end of last season. And now that they got rid of Jamal Williams, who actually, like Jamal Williams is going to be so annoying this year because anybody who takes DeAndre Swift is going to end up being upset when Jamal Williams is scoring all the touchdowns. But I think Dillon could be, if you're somebody that kind of doesn't address the running back position immediately, that A.J. Dillon is somebody that you can pick up and draft and maybe even hold on to towards the end of the season. I think that he's a pretty good option for you. And again, I hate to praise a Packer. That's one of my favorite picks that I've been going with late on. And now, I've also been looking at Denzel Mims for the New York Jets. Like, let's say that Zach Wilson's actually a good quarterback. I think there's going to be a lot of production in the slot for the Jets. So I think Mims, I really liked him coming out of the draft. I thought he was a good future pick, and I thought that he had some potential. And again, it's going to cost you a 13th, a 14th round pick. You're not spending a lot on him. You can leave him on the bench for a couple of weeks to wait and see. But I think that he's somebody that you need to be looking at.
Adam Brack, still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Adam, what's been your greatest year or greatest team when you played fantasy?
Oh my gosh. There was, I know it's weird that I can think of it. That's what my life is like. There was one year in our NFL Fantasy Live League. I had a team, because a lot of times when you look at these teams, you always look at how different it is from your draft, where you're like, hey, you're looking at oh yeah, I picked this guy up off the waiver wire. I made this trade or something like this. There was one year where I had 13 of my 15 picks were still on my roster, and I was winning, and I won because my draft was fantastic. And it was also a year that I didn't draft a quarterback till the very last round, and I took a guy named what was that guy's name? Oh yeah, Patrick Mahomes. So yeah, this is why I like to wait for a quarterback. Now, obviously, I can't do that now, but that was everybody was roasting me. And somebody right in front of me, because they noticed I didn't have a quarterback and I was being very smug about it, which if you've listened to me for the last 20 minutes, you're going to be like, this guy smug? No, get out of here. But being kind of a jerk about it. And so the guy right in front of me is like, oh, he's like, Rick, I'm gonna ruin you right here. And they took Phillip Rivers. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you ruined my whole season. And he's like, really? And I'm like, no, I'm taking Mahomes. And they just laughed. Laughter erupted in that room. Oh, okay, good luck with that. And, the shame that they have to live with now, as I constantly bring this up, is, it's one of my favorite. That, and I also had Peyton Manning the year he had 55 touchdowns. I think those are my two things that stand out to me. Oh, and also my buddy Doug, who's a Chicago guy as well. He's a Schaumburg guy, but he's a Chicago guy as well. And last year he took Clyde Edwards-Helaire in front of me, and I took Derrick Henry. And needless to say, I ended up losing in the finals, so it's not that great of a story, but he would have won if he would have had Derrick Henry. So I always delight in that one.
What about your biggest mistake that you've made?
There's too many. There's always oh my gosh. I think one year I made a bet. I made a proclamation of hey, if I don't do this, I'll take I'll take Gostkowski in the 5th round as a joke. And you know what? I lived up to it. And people will you'll still see it on Reddit. This is the guy that took Gostkowski in the 5th round. I'm like, hey, I was paying off a bet, but okay, I'll wear that. That used to be the thing that I would hear the most and this wasn't really a fantasy thing, but I picked the 49ers to go 3-13 the year that they went to the Super Bowl. And so I've had to live with that, and it's fine. It's, it is what it is. I would go on to this radio's KNBR in San Francisco. I would go on every week and go eat crow with the host, who's a friend of mine. And even George Kittle, who I'm Twitter friends with, or I've met him once. He's also a huge wrestling fan, so we get along. Like, he roasted me on Twitter the other day, or a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about French fries, and he's like, "You're as wrong here as you were when you made this pick." And he has a screen grab of me 3-13. You could, like, if you Google Adam Rank, I think most of the images are me standing in front of a board picking the 49ers to go 3-13. So it's just one of those things like, yeah, I did it. I made a bad call. I'm not going to run from it. It is what it is.
Adam, before we finish up today, last question. Is it true that you were voted most likely to never have a girlfriend in high school?
You know what's funny about that? It's not true. And the only reason it's not true is that nobody would know who I was in high school. Like, I wasn't popular enough that they would even think of me. They'd be like, what? Like, I still go to weddings. And this happened to me, I think, 2 summers ago, where I was sitting at a wedding. I was at a table, and this lady introduces herself to me, and she's like, "Oh," because I grew up in Southern California in a city that had a couple of different high schools. She's like, "What high school did you go to?" And I'm like, "I went to Corona." And she's like, "Oh my gosh." She's like, "I did too. Like, what year?" And I'm like, "Okay, Kristen, I was in history class with you. You sat next to Stephanie Smith." "Oh, really?" And I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "Did you play sports?" I'm like, "Yeah, I was on the basketball team." Like, I don't know how I was so far under the radar. I think, for these kids today don't understand. Like, Star Wars wasn't cool. Comic books, not cool. Wrestling, not cool. Like, all the stuff that I was into, cool now. Like, I would be I would be the most popular, like, 17-year-old right now. But in that dark time for me, not so much. And people didn't like fantasy sports either. So I had a lot of things working against me. So unfortunately, that was a little bit of an exaggeration. But the actual story is honestly worse. So.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining me. Really a pleasure to have you on, and best wishes, of course, as the NFL season gets going and fantasy football starts up too. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. The pleasure was all on this side of the phone.